20 minutes late now. Our next speaker is a freelance writer who writes a science blog for Forbes Media called Progressive Download. He's written for many publications, and he's an author of a biography of Lemaitre. He's going to tell us about Lemaitre. John Farrell.
Can you hear me on this part on the mic?
Speaking loud.
Not speaking loud enough. Okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a personal profile of Lemaitre, just because I thought that would be a little departure from all the science. Sometimes referred to as father of the Big Bang, and sometimes less politely as the Big Bang Man. Georges Lemaitre was born on July 14th, 1894, in the Belgian town of Charleroi. And by the way, I'm going to apologize in advance for how I mangle French. Ich habe Deutsch studiert aufs Gymnasium. Charleroi, as I understand, was a comparatively recent home for the Lemaitre family, which had its roots in Courcelles to the west. Lemaitres worked with their hands. They were weavers, known as coal miners, and Lemaitres' great-grandfather Clement had served in Napoleon's 112th line. According to family history, he was twice wounded. His father, Joseph, was born in 1867, and he came from the first generation of the Lemaitres to complete a university education. In 1893, when he was 26, he married Marguerite Lannoy, and they started a family, ultimately raising 4 sons. Lemaitre was the oldest. Joseph studied law, and although he became an accredited lawyer, he didn't practice at first. He formed his own business and invented a new procedure to stretch glass. I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm not being technical, but it's a model that would prefigure the later methods employed to this day by the European Glaverbell Glassware Company. However, just to really quickly, the factory burned down, and he ended up working as a lawyer in Brussels for the bank. At age 10, in 1904, Lemaitre entered the Jesuit High School of the Sacred Heart in Charleroi. Over the 6 years he spent there, he distinguished himself in mathematics and during his last 2 years in physics and chemistry. He then went on to Jesuit prep school in Brussels, the College St. Michel, in 1910 to study mathematics for the entrance exam to the College of Engineering in Louvain. He was actually intending to be an engineer. Of his many teachers from this period, one Father Pete Ernest Barou stands out, not only because he represented a role model for the young Lemaitre as a priest and a scientist, but also because of his thoughtfulness regarding the boundaries that separated theology and science, a subject that would remain central to Lemaitres' thinking throughout his life. Lemaitre recalled one occasion when the classroom when Barou gave him pause after Lemaitre expressed himself excitedly in a particular passage from the book of Genesis that seemed to suggest a foreshadowing of developments in science. The older priest held him to curb his enthusiasm. If there is a connection, Barou said, it's a coincidence and of no importance, and if you should prove to me that it exists, I would consider it unfortunate. It will merely encourage more thoughtless people to imagine that the Bible teaches infallible science, whereas the most we can say is that occasionally one of the prophets made a correct scientific guess. As most of our friends here from Europe can tell, in this country we are surrounded by people who do this all the time. In August of 1914, Lemaitre and his younger brother Jacques were planning a cycling tour of Tyrol when the war started. The Reich armies marched into Belgium that very month. The two brothers enlisted on the 9th of August in the Belgian 5th Corps Volunteers. After receiving some basic instruction, they were shipped to one of the 6 divisions of the Belgian 3rd Army. By October 18th, Lemaitre was in the midst of the Battle of the Yser. We saw quite a bit of carnage, actually. And Odin Godard speculated that some of what he saw and lived through is what inspired him to become a priest, although it's also fairly well known that he knew even earlier than that. He told his parents he wanted to be a priest supposedly when he was 9 years old. But it's quite possible that what he lived through just made it more solid for him. He was eventually transferred out of the infantry to an artillery division, and according to family legend, he incurred the wrath of one instructor when he had the gall to point out an error he discovered in the ballistics manual of the army. So by the end of the war, his brother Jacques attained a commission as a lieutenant, while his older brother had to content himself with remaining a sergeant, perhaps, as he half-seriously told the journalists later on, because of, quote, bad character, unquote. For all that, he did receive the Croix de Guerre for bravery. His first step to finish a PhD was in 1919, Catholic University of Louvain when he passed the supplementary exams to become a candidate in physical and mathematical sciences. He obtained his PhD summa cum laude in 1920, along with a baccalaureate in Thomas philosophy. At the same time, he decided on his vocation and entered the house of St. Rombaut as a seminarian in October of 1920. Rombaut was an extension of the main seminary for the Archdiocese of Malines under the bishopric of Cardinal Mercier, who would become one of his mentors and sponsors. Mercier is an interesting character. There's not a lot I know about him, but apparently he was the one who really spearheaded for Pope Leo the revival of Aquinas, the teaching of Aquinas and Thomas philosophy, because Pope Leo, coming after Pope Pius IX, thought it would be a good idea to inject more science into Catholic education. We need someone like him again. In 1922, Lemaitre wrote his own short thesis, The Physics of Einstein, which he entered in a competition for scholarship from the Belgian government to study abroad. He won the scholarship, which allowed him to travel across the Channel to the UK for a year of study and to meet the man whose books on Einstein physics had opened up a new world for him, and that was Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington. And by the way, one of the myths about Lemaitre is that he's a Jesuit. He was just a standard diocesan priest. That's just a shot of with the family after his first Mass. Under Eddington's supervision, he planned in the 1923-1924 academic year to write a paper on the concept of simultaneity and general relativity, how it must be modified when shifting from objects accelerating in a straight path to objects accelerating in curved space. And the very next year, he went to Harvard, also MIT. He was kind of odd. He was settling back and forth between Harvard and MIT. He did 2 more doctorates. With a new scholarship from the CRB, the Educational Foundation funded by the Committee in Relief of Belgium, he planned to meet and study with some of Eddington's American colleagues, chiefly those who specialized in the direct observations of stars and nebulae with some of the world's best equipment. Harlow Shapley, who was late of the Mount Wilson Observatory and director of Harvard College Observatory from 1920 until 1952. He welcomed Lemaitre for the academic year of 1924-25. So it's interesting is he was already, I think, thinking about looking for hard data to add evidence to an expanding universe model or some kind of dynamic model. In the summer of 24, when he came to Harvard, Shapley suggested that he study the theory of variable stars once he was familiar with their observations, and this entailed spending much of September of the academic year at the Dominion Observatory in Ottawa, Canada. He spent a lot of time between 1923 and 1926 on trains. This also entailed special tutoring in the subject of Cepheid variables from a fellow countryman. And at Harvard, Lemaitre took courses in experimental spectroscopy, as well as courses on interference problems in spectroscopy. Just added, thanks to the Lowell Archives. This is a postcard that Lemaitre sent to Schleifer on his way by train to the Lowell Observatory, June 21st. I can't read it, but basically it says, "Dear sir, I'll call upon you Tuesday." And I don't think he stayed long. I don't know. It'd be interesting to find out how long he stayed at Lowell, whether it was for 1 day, 2 days, but then back on the train to Chicago. As you know, he also traveled to Mount Wilson, met with Hubble in 1925, and then went back to Louvain, where he became an assistant professor. Harry Nussbaum talked about this excellently, so I won't dwell too much on his first paper in 1925, noted the Sitters universe, except what fascinated me when I found out that Alan Guth said Lemaitre's paper on de Sitter was what first gave him the inspiration for his inflationary theory, which I thought was fascinating. And then his 1927 paper, which again has been discussed. When he finished this paper, he made the curious decision to submit it to an obscure Belgian journal, the Annales des Sociétés Scientifiques de Bruxelles, rather than one of the more widely read journals like the Zeitschrift, as Friedland did. Neither apparently did he consider sending it to Eddington for possible publication in the monthly notices. Now, there's been all sorts of speculation about, like, why did he do it? Why did he put it in this obscure journal? And I have to say, I'm not satisfied with the general, what I've read is that, well, he was just kind of, very modest. He didn't want to draw any attention. But after all that mileage he racked up, going all over the US and Canada to get all this data, it hardly seems to make sense. One theory I had, which I mentioned to Cormac, was that he figured he knew the importance of what he was doing, and he wanted to publish it in the Belgian journal because he was somewhat nationalistic. The other idea was that I think he wanted to publish it as quickly as possible so that he could send copies to Eddington and Einstein or show it to whatever. That's just my theory. I have not the slightest evidence to support that. It's just that I find it hard to believe that he just buried it there because he was shy and retiring and didn't want to draw any attention to himself. As we know, the initial meeting with Einstein at Solvay, your calculations are correct, but your physics is abominable, which is pretty much exactly what he said to Friedman. He is said to, then we jump ahead to 1930 when Hubble had published his findings and Einstein, De Sitter, and Eddington decided we have to do something. We have to decide which of the models, the De Sitter model or the Einstein model, is going to be it. And he said to have quipped at the time, well, shall we put a little motion into Einstein's universe, or shall we put a little matter into De Sitter's? The notes from the proceedings were published a few months later. When Lemaitre read them in Belgium, he immediately sent his former mentor a message along with another copy of his paper telling him that he had in fact already solved this problem. This is George McVitie, who later recalled, I well remember the day when Eddington rather shamefacedly showed me a letter from Lemaitre which reminded him of the solution to the problem which Lemaitre had already given. Eddington confessed that though he'd seen the paper, he'd completely forgot about it until that moment. So the oversight was quickly remedied by Eddington's letter to Nature of 1930, in which he drew attention to Lemaitres' work of 3 years before. Notwithstanding Einstein's dismissal of the cosmological constant, he was impressed with Lemaitres' expanding model once the observational data became widely known and Eddington publicized Lemaitres' solution. He in fact cited Lemaitres and Tolman's solutions when he visited Caltech, I think in 1932. Like De Sitter and many of his colleagues, he embraced Lemaitres' theory in light of the new data. I'm not talking about the primeval atom, I'm just talking about the expanding model system, that's clear. He publicly accepted the new paradigm of expansion in April 1931 in Pasadena and at Mount Wilson, and mentioned Lemaitres' work in conjunction with Tolman's as being the convincing factor for him. Not long after they met in 1933 in California, he recommended Lemaitre alongside two others for the Belgian Franke Prize from King Leopold III, which next to the Nobel at the time was the most generous then in existence. Very briefly, this is pretty much where I think Lemaitre recedes from the picture because not only because of World War II, his father died in 1942 and he felt more of an obligation to stay close to his mother. His brothers were married and had families. De Sitter was gone by this point. Eddington died in the 40s. And Einstein became more and more preoccupied, as we all know, with his unified field theory. So at this point, he's really kind of out of the history of the Big Bang model, and Gamow and his team would kind of pick it up from here. So to get on to some more interesting interactions, in November of '51, Lemaitre had been invited to Rome at the end of a study week for a solemn audience, where Pope Pius XII famously said, this quote, it would seem that basically he just said, the Big Bang is evidence of, fiat books from the Bible. And Father Baruch must have been turning in his grave. And Lemaitre, as late Erna McMullen pointed out later, it was the one time he saw Lemaitre really, really upset, was this interference, he thought, on the Pope's part. Having been appointed to the membership in the Pontifical Academy by Pius's predecessor, because of his standing among cosmologists, he was understandably dismayed as to why he hadn't at least been consulted about the Pope's address before he did that. But within a few months, he and the director of the Vatican Observatory met with the Pope to explain that such blatant connections drawn between science and theology would not help the cause of the Church, nor the progress of science. And less than a year later, when the Pope addressed a gathering of astronomers at Castel Gandolfo, he refrained from discussing the metaphysical implications of the Big Bang theory. But this is another thing, I think, that kind of further pushed Lemaitre away from continued interest in working on the Big Bang theory. I think he felt really embarrassed by this. And as I'm going to show you, while they were friends, got along well, Hoyle really stuck it to him after the Pope's speech. And George Gamow had quite a bit of fun with it as well. That said, Lemaitre and Hoyle got along quite well in spite of the differences over theory and their vastly different backgrounds. This is what I call the surf and turf scene. Hoyle later recollected in 1957, he and I did a 2-week drive through Italy and the Alps. We only had one disagreement, and it wasn't over cosmology, it was over food. It was a Friday, and at dinner that night I ordered a big steak, while George, as befitted his position, ordered fish. When the waitress delivered our orders, the steak was good. The fish, on the other hand, was enormous. A prince of a fish, which clearly warranted comment, So in all innocence, I said, "Now at last, George, I see why you are a Catholic." At this, George became red-faced and peevish. For a few seconds, I thought the ghost of Martin Luther had tempted me into a serious religio-diplomatic indiscretion. And then in a flash, I realized that he didn't like fish. He desperately wanted my steak. During the 50s, as I said, while he retreated from the Big Bang theorizing, he got more and more involved in computing, especially when scientific use of computers on campuses was on the rise. He lent Louvain's University rector the funds to purchase the campus's first electronic computer, a Burroughs E101. I'm sure there are probably people here who are really into the history of computers and know exactly what it's like. In the next decade, his very last years, he upgraded to an IBM, then an Elliott, and on these machines, he taught himself assembler languages, busied himself with numerical calculations of problems in celestial mechanics, which he enjoyed handing on to his students. Vatican II. In 1960, he was made president of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and shortly after the death of John XXIII, he was bemused to find himself put on a commission to study birth control. His question was, "I'm a mathematician, what am I doing here?" Nevertheless, he did make a kind of modest recommendation for modifying the Church's teaching, which was ignored. In late December '64, he suffered a mild heart attack while he was in Rome. Upon returning to Louvain, he was hospitalized for a short period and put on a strict dietary regimen. But shortly after, he was diagnosed with a form of leukemia. He was in the hospital when his colleague Odin Goddard brought him the news that Penzias and Wilson had detected the CMV, and he died June 17th, 1966. These are some recent personal recollections I got from Thomas Bancroft, who's now a retired professor of mathematics at Brown. He was at UC Berkeley studying mathematics the last time Lemaitre came to the U.S., so he told me a little bit about his interactions with them. He told me he's not a very tall man, probably 5'7" or 8 inches in height, but he was rotund, almost like Santa Claus, he said. I drove a Volkswagen in those days, and when we drove to San Francisco, I was worried he wouldn't fit in the car. From that picture, you can kind of get a sense of his enormousness. I had numerous conversations with him about his life at Louvain, Bancroft said, and I was surprised to hear that he had never learned any Flemish, the language of the majority of people in Belgium. He was, in fact, a vocal advocate of French, to the point that his house was once the target of a small bomb thrown at his front door, and he was quite proud of that. We're running out of time. This is more into the theological debates, kind of theology and science side. But I was fascinated by this quote from Dirac. When I was talking with Lemaitre about his subject and feeling stimulated by the grandeur of the picture he's given us, I told him I thought cosmology was the branch of science that lies closest to religion. But he did not agree with me. After thinking it over, he suggested psychology is lying closest to religion. Kind of a cryptic. But then it ties into what Lemaitre himself said later on when he was pressed for the theological implications of the Big Bang. As far as I can see, such a theory remains entirely outside any metaphysical or religious question. Leaves the materialist free to deny any transcendental being. He may keep for the bottom of space-time the same attitude of mind he has been able to adopt for events occurring in non-singular places. For the believer, it removes any attempt at familiarity with God, as were Laplace's flick of the finger or Jean's finger of God. It's consonant with the wording of Isaiah speaking of the hidden God, hidden even in the beginning. Science has not to surrender in face of the universe, and when Pascal tries to infer the existence of God from the supposed infinitude of nature, we may think that he's looking in the wrong direction. I thought another fascinating thought. I'll close with this quote from Jean Eisenstadt, who's done a lot of work, looked over Lemaitre's papers, in particular the paper Lemaitre wrote on Schwarzschild's solution, which later inspired Tolman and Oppenheimer, who wrote kind of the first paper on how to model the collapse of a star, basically a black hole. One of the most important characteristics of his approach, I think, is the subtle interplay between local and global concerns in his work, the stars and the cosmos, contracting nebulae and the expanding universe, the condensation of a star and the collapse of the universe. In a way, Lemaitre was able to describe the local in the global. Stars embedded in the universe, the Schwarzschild solution is described in the same coordinates as Friedmann's solution. This tendency to combine the local and the global, the awareness of the parallels between cosmology and the treatment of an individual star, enabled him to view things in new and unexpected ways, to look, so to speak, at the Schwarzschild singularity from the interior, or at the universe from the exterior. It was this general approach and his extraordinary facility in delicately manipulating equations of the universe that enabled Lemaitre to shake off the dogma of the impenetrability of the Schwarzschild singularity. And I'll close with that.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
It's wonderful, John. Thank you very much for that and for your lovely book. And just one thing I often wonder about, maybe you can cast some light on. I mean, whereas Friedman dies young, Lemaitre, as you say, just disappears from the stage. It's extraordinary. And I don't think the whole thing of the Pope, and I know Gamma might have been making fun of that and all that, I don't think that's strong enough somehow. And I wonder, could it be a combination of, number one, the primeval atom thing? He really endured quite a lot of unfair criticism. Even Einstein, literally specifically did draw a link with creationism and stuff like that, and that must have hurt. I think of all people, that would have really hurt him. And then the second thing is when you combine that with the fact that I think the primeval atom hypothesis was pretty much blown out of the water quite quickly because developments in nuclear physics, that happened quite quick. So the combination of those. It's complete speculation, but you wonder he may never have recovered. He may have felt almost a figure of ridicule or something.
That's possible, yeah. And Goddard during the 50s constantly asked and urged him, talk to Gamma. You should do, get together and ramp up to the next level. But for reasons that we don't know. I mean, I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that during the war he really was cut off from everybody for a long time. And I think by habit, even before that, he was kind of used to working on his own, somewhat in isolation. But he was notoriously bad at saving his correspondence. So I think it was great finding that postcard here that he sent to Slipher. But he wasn't so good at saving things that people sent to him or his own correspondence.
Can I say as well, one thing Goddard says somewhere, I can't remember where, and I think it makes a lot of sense to me. He quite respected Hoyle, like a lot of mathematicians. He really respected the idea that Hoyle comes up with this idea, yeah, you can have an expanding universe, but it doesn't have to be an evolving one. And he just liked the idea. He didn't agree with it, but he liked the sort of, the way he sort of, that would explain why they wouldn't be in loggerheads, I think.
Yes, I think professionally they really had a lot of respect for each other, yeah. One thing I wanted to say to Ari's point, which coming for me, just coming to writing this book about Lemaitre was kind of like accidental, but and I studied literature. I wasn't a science undergrad, but I read lots of popular science books in the 70s and 80s, and they always discussed Friedman. They never mentioned Lemaitre. In fact, they only did mention Lemaitre, and I'm thinking of popular books like Isaac Asimov, Paul Davies, things like that. They would mention Lemaitre as kind of an afterthought. He came up with this primeval atom theory that most people thought was kind of crackpot, and that was all I knew about him until I was actually researching something else and came across Eisenstein's paper, and I thought, wow, this guy had his fingers in a lot of different things. So, which I think, I really enjoyed Ari's presentation, but from my perspective, Lemaitre was very, very kind of recent. I always thought the guy was just kind of a minor character in all of this. When I read those, and again, admittedly, these are popular, books for the popular audience. It was always Friedman, Hubble, Einstein. They almost never discussed Lemaitre as kind of this, except this guy was kind of in the background, arguing for a primeval atom theory. So I had no idea that, he wrote that paper in 1927 or the Note and de Sitter and stuff like that. So I think even Lemaitre's kind of revival has been very, very recent. But anyway, that's.
Robert? Yeah, can I just add to that? It seems to me that Lemaitre has been kind of recovered since maybe around about 1980 when there was the book, the Elysian book by Berger. And then Helga Kral started to go into the Lemaitre papers and really did a very important job working through the Lemaitre material starting in the late 1980s and kind of continues on in a way with that research. And so I think that was really, since, as I say, 1980, Lemaitre has been much more on the map than
right.
before.
And then the first really comprehensive biography, Dominique Lambert's, was only 2000. It was just very relatively recent.
Yeah,